Welcome to this explainer. So, have you ever wondered how an ancient framework of laws, developed well over 1,000 years ago, actually continues to shape our incredibly fast-paced, highly complex modern world? Today, we're uncovering the mechanics behind a topic that is often misunderstood, frequently debated, and, honestly, incredibly influential on a global scale.
Okay, let's dive into this. To understand just how relevant this topic is today, I want you to think about this number: $3 trillion. That's enough to boggle the mind, right? Well, I was absolutely amazed to learn that this is the current estimated scale of the global Islamic finance sector. We're not just talking about some abstract theological concept here. It's a massive living system powering banks, cutting-edge fintech startups, and global investment portfolios right this second. To figure out how a 1,400-year-old legal tradition manages a $3 trillion modern market, we really need to get under the hood and look at its mechanics.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the origins of Sharia law, then move to ijtihad, adapting to change, explore the Islamic finance boom, look at Sharia councils in the UK, and finally, navigating the gender debate. And I promise you, this historical deep dive has a very practical, real-world destination today.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, Origins of Sharia Law. Basically, Sharia is comprehensively defined as the sacred law of Islam. It governs virtually every single aspect of a Muslim's life, from the public and political spheres all the way down to private and religious ones. It's fundamentally derived from the Quran and the Sunnah, which are the teachings and practices of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, what's fascinating is that back in the 7th century, the introduction of early Sharia was actually a massive revolutionary step forward. Before this, pre-Islamic Arabian tribal norms relied heavily on magical sacral procedures, divination, and endless brutal blood feuds. You literally had zero legal protection outside your immediate tribe. Sharia arrived and introduced a system designed to protect the underprivileged, orphans, and the weak. It replaced violent tribal retribution with structured, predictable legal and ethical obligations.
Let's move to and see how this builds chronologically. We start with that pre-Islamic customary law in the 7th century. Then, this shifts in the early 7th century when the Prophet Muhammad acted as a religious reformer and arbitrator. By the mid-7th century, the early caliphs began acting as administrators, and they were blending those Quranic rulings with the very practical needs of governing rapidly expanding territories. Finally, jumping to between the 8th and 10th centuries, under the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties, we see the formal, structured development of Islamic law. The creation of actual judges, known as qadis, and the establishment of the 4 major Sunni schools of law happened right here. It went from informal arbitration to a highly sophisticated legal science.
Moving right along to Section 2, Ijtihad, adapting to change.
If you've ever wondered how an ancient law doesn't just freeze in time and become totally obsolete, the secret ingredient is a concept called ijtihad. So the crucial point is that this stems from an Arabic root meaning effort or exertion. It is this intense, rigorous intellectual process where a highly qualified jurist derives brand new legal rulings for completely unprecedented issues. You can't just guess or make things up. It requires an immense, disciplined knowledge of classical texts, analogies, and the ultimate overarching objectives of Sharia. When the Quran obviously doesn't explicitly mention a modern invention, ijtihad is the bridge that connects ancient divine principles to our new reality.
Just think about the wild contemporary dilemmas this solves today. I mean, the classical scholars of the 8th century definitely didn't write laws about artificial intelligence or in vitro fertilization, but through collective ijtihad, where panels of scholars, doctors, and economists all sit down and collaborate, modern fiqh councils can address these exact issues. They determine the ethics of organ transplantation by prioritizing the core Quranic principle of preserving human life. They tackle climate change by invoking the Islamic concept of human stewardship over the earth. It's a living, breathing mechanism for adaptation.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, the Islamic finance boom.
At the absolute core of Islamic economics is the strict prohibition of riba. Simply put, riba means interest, specifically interest-based lending. Under Sharia, making money simply from the passage of time on a loan is completely off the table. Instead, Islamic finance insists that financial risks must be shared fairly between parties, and absolutely every transaction has to be tied to a tangible, real-world asset. This radically pushes the system away from traditional debt-based economies and heavily toward profit-sharing and asset-backed investments.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how creative financial engineering takes over, since institutions can't just charge interest on a mortgage or a business loan. Looking at these structures, Murabaha functions as a transparent cost-plus model, which is essentially a markup sale.
Musharaka is a true partnership where both profits and losses are shared, heavily incentivizing the bank to ensure the business actually succeeds. And sukuk functions kind of like a bond, but instead of representing a debt you owe, it represents fractional ownership in an actual asset that generates a return. It's quite brilliant, really.
To maintain global credibility and actually attract that massive pool of Sharia-conscious investors we mentioned earlier, financial institutions have to follow a strict 5-step compliance process. It starts with establishing a board of Sharia scholars to review products, and then it requires rigorous, ongoing audits. And today, it's not just traditional Islamic banks doing this. Global fintech startups and Western investment platforms are adopting this exact process to offer ethically conscious, highly transparent financial models to millennial investors and global markets alike.
Let's shift gears a bit for Section 4, Sharia councils in the UK.
So the very first Sharia council in the UK, the Islamic Sharia Council, was established in East London back in 1982. Now, it's absolutely vital to note that these are not formal courts of law. They are strictly voluntary advisory bodies. They offer non-binding advice on things like civil disputes, Sharia-compliant finance, and family matters, most notably divorce. This is actually part of a broader British tradition of accommodating religious minorities. It's very much like the Jewish Beth Din courts, which have operated in the UK for centuries. But remember, in all cases, British secular law takes absolute precedence over any religious recommendation.
However, this parallel system is not without serious controversy. Critics, prominently including Baroness Caroline Cox, who brought these very issues before the UK Parliament, have raised significant concerns. Based on testimonies, critics argue that these councils can sometimes offer unequal access to divorce, where men can divorce quite easily, but women must formally petition the council. There are also deep concerns about councils overstepping their bounds into criminal matters like grievous bodily harm, which strictly belong to the police. Furthermore, critics worry that some vulnerable women are coerced by their families into using these tribunals instead of accessing their full rights under UK civil courts, sometimes because the councils present themselves with the false authority of a formal court.
This leads us right into our final area, Section 5, Navigating the Gender Debate. And this brilliantly illustrates a fascinating tension between historical intent and modern application. You see, the original spirit of Sharia, as laid out in the Quran, was remarkably progressive for its time. It explicitly improved women's rights to inheritance, property ownership, and legal autonomy far beyond anything that existed in pre-Islamic tribal laws. Yet, researchers and historians point out that over the centuries, deeply entrenched patriarchal cultural norms and feudalism layered themselves over the original texts. These later cultural additions are what many argue have stifled equality and created the intense friction we see today in debates over women's rights in various Muslim-majority societies and diaspora communities.
So, we've seen how mechanisms like ijtihad allow for incredible adaptation in incredibly complex fields like global finance and bioethics. And, on the flip side, we've seen the real friction that occurs when traditional systems meet modern secular rights. The future of Sharia isn't about being frozen in the 7th century. It's an ongoing, highly dynamic process of interpretation, which leaves us with this profound question. As our world rapidly evolves, how will these ancient divine principles continue to adapt and seamlessly integrate with modern societies without losing their foundational spirit?